All right, so on this session, I'd like to talk about a new clinical standard that's coming online toward the end of this year, and which will involve all of our MEC EMS providers who hold any level of certificate as an EMR, EMT, advanced EMT, or paramedic. And specifically, I'd like to talk about credentialing of providers. So in order to start the conversation, I think we need to define what is provider credentialing. So credentialing is verification by the medical director, that's me, that the EMS provider is competent to practice at the specific level of care as defined by the EMS protocol and permitted by the scope of practice for the level of provider certification. In other words, the medical director verifies that the provider has the skills, knowledge, experience necessary to provide patient care as identified by the EMS protocol and as allowed or permitted by the state based upon the provider's level of certification within the state. So I think you'll ask, why are we doing this? Well, there's been a lot of talk about this over the past couple of years among the professional physician groups that provide medical oversight for EMS. The National Association of EMS Physicians, also known as NEMSP, as well as the National Registry, have released a joint position statement on EMS provider credentialing. I've attached, or available with this conversation will be a copy of that position description or position statement, and I'd encourage you to read it. In addition, the medical director is responsible for verifying the provider is competent to perform under the protocol under which the EMS service operates. And that verification and responsibility by law rests solely with the medical director. So I, as the medical director for MEC EMS, are responsible for verifying that providers are competent to perform under the MEC EMS protocol. At this point, based on our last audit, we have over 600 providers who operate under the MEC EMS protocol. With Lancaster coming on board, there'll be another 60 or 80 providers as well. And I know a lot of our providers. I have a good idea of what the capabilities are for a good number of our providers, but I can't say that for all of our providers. So I think we need an organized process of verifying that our providers have the knowledge and technical skills necessary to function our protocol. In addition, I think we've reached the point of professionalism within pre-hospital care that it's the right thing for us to do in terms of verifying that our providers have the necessary clinical skills to provide for patient care. And for me, when I talk about things like this that have the potential to be controversial, first thing I do to look at my own personal opinion is to think about what would happen if I was the patient and one of our providers was called upon to provide care for me. And I think it's really, I would be more comfortable, or actually I'd be even more comfortable as a family member of mine, had care provided by a provider whose competence has been verified by me or by someone else. What's been the timeline for this? Well, this has been a 6-month process, if not longer. I introduced the subject to the EMS chiefs at one of our meetings in 2017. Eventually, we formed a work group consisting of 3 chiefs and myself, and we drafted a clinical standard that was then reviewed with input given by the EMS chiefs and by our EMS coordinators. And in May at their chiefs meeting, the chiefs approved the clinical standard. The standard's in effect for calendar 2019, but for current providers, there's a 6-month look back into 2018, meaning as part of our assessment and verification of your capabilities, we will look at each provider's participation in various defined activities in the last half of 2018. So that would include participation in MEC Minute, review in our fall competency that will come out through the PI committee, as well as other activities. Also in effect for 2019 is a credentialing process for new hires. It's different than those providers who are established within our organizations, and I'll review those expectations in a couple slides. When the chiefs approved the clinical standard, it was approved with the condition that the EMS chiefs and the medical director will revisit the standard in the spring of 2019. We'll review the standard after it has been in effect and after we've had a chance to credential our providers for the first time. So who is subject to the standard? Essentially everyone who's employed or runs with a member agency who is certified by the Ohio Division of EMS to practice as either an EMR, EMT, advanced EMT, or paramedic. And why is it everyone? I realize that there are a good number of our providers who predominantly work in an administrative role, or who may be on an engine or ladder company and may not have that much opportunity to provide patient care. But the fact of the matter is everyone is at risk or may have the opportunity to provide patient care. And when you provide patient care, your standard of practice is defined by the level of certification that you hold through the Division of EMS. So if you are certified as a paramedic but rarely touch a patient, if you do provide patient care, you are expected to provide care to the standard set by our agencies for a paramedic. So that's why we're setting this standard for everybody. We simply don't know when you, as a member of one of our organizations, may provide direct patient care. Let's discuss some other definitions. So, we talked about what credentialing is. A more basic definition is what is certification. So certification is approval by the state of Ohio that allows you to legally practice in Ohio as an EMS provider to the extent the scope of practice allows you to practice as a pre-hospital provider. So the state has determined that you've met the basic certification standards to serve as an EMR, EMT, advanced, or paramedic. And basically what the state does is it verifies that you've met the basic entry-level requirements for certification by the state. So for me as a physician in Ohio, I am licensed by the state of Ohio to practice as a physician. But in Ohio, to receive your license as a physician, you essentially have to finish medical school and do a year of residency or internship. But for me to serve as an emergency physician, I have to go through residency training to meet an even higher level of training. But the state of Ohio does not get involved with specialty designation. So for the state of Ohio giving me a license to practice as a physician, the state verifies that I meet the basic entry-level standards. That's the same as what the state does for you as an EMS provider. When you receive your state certificate, the state is verifying that you've made the basic entry-level standards to function as a medic or advanced or EMT in Ohio. A second definition is authorization to practice. So by law, you can only practice as a EMS provider if you are authorized to do so by the medical director or a physician providing medical oversight. So when you function under the MEC EMS protocol, you function because I authorize you to do so under the protocol. And that decision to authorize or not authorize or to restrict practice is permitted by the state to be only done by a medical director. So if we look at the components of the credentialing process, really there are three components, and I've got them listed 1, 2, 3, and we already do the number 1 and number 3. So when you start to provide care as an EMS provider, you can only do so after your department has verified that you have a valid certificate issued by the state of Ohio to practice as an EMS provider. And then up to this point, I have routinely authorized everyone to practice under the protocol, and that authorization has been routine, and there's really been very little review by me of every provider's credentials and capabilities before that authorization is practiced. For all intents and purposes, it's a blanket authorization. So the second item is what we're adding to the process, and this component is a demonstration by the provider that they're competent to practice under the protocol, and that I, as the medical director, or if you're working for a different EMS agency, that EMS agency's medical director is verifying that you are capable and competent to practice under the protocol. So we already do 2/3 of what's part of this 3-step process. We're adding a step 2. So what is the process? Well, effective January 1st, 2019, for existing providers, whether they're full-time or part-time, we are requiring that certain information be submitted to me by each EMS agency, verifying that the provider has a valid certificate. In other words, at the time of submission, it's been verified that each provider has a valid certificate to practice in the state, or if there are any restrictions on that provider's certification, those restrictions are identified for me. That the provider completes an annual protocol review, and it will be done in the fall. This was actually set up as one of the standards by the EMS coordinators. They felt it was important that we review the protocol with everyone. And essentially this is going to be an open book test, and I would encourage people to do this as a group learning function. It's our intent that in the fall we will distribute learning points coming out of the protocol, and that there'll be a written assessment of that review, and again, it will be an open book procedure, open book test, and we would encourage people to do it as a group where they sit down and go through the questions. The intent is for you just to review the knowledge of the protocol. It's not meant to keep somebody from practicing. If you participate in the process and you review the material, you should do well. Also set up a requirement that you review and submit for CME 4 of the 2018 MEC minutes. In 2020, when we look back into 2019 for recredentialing, we'll expect you to review 8 out of 12 MEC minutes for the year. We'll also have 2 competencies a year through the PI committee. In terms of the credentialing process that starts the 1st of next year, we'll want everybody to complete the 2018 competency. It will be on sepsis, and again, it's meant to be a learning experience and a measure of our own capabilities. We'll also expect all providers to go through an annual training event regarding our high-performance CPR efforts. This should be pretty straightforward. It shouldn't take a lot of your time, but we'll look to the EMS coordinators to make sure that you have the opportunity to review this over the next 6 months. If somebody comes on board as a new hire, I will provisionally credential that provider for 90 days. If they're coming on as a part-timer, we've extended that to 180 days to give them adequate time to get the experience in. We'll have similar requirements of verification of certification. We'll have an expectation that there'll be an assessment of the provider's knowledge of our protocol, and that there'll be completion of certain clinical knowledge and skill assessments. These are very basic and should be much less than what you currently expect your new hires to go through as part of an orientation process to the EMS vehicle and our EMS protocol. So for the agencies for which I've actually seen their orientation processes, what we're looking for with new hires is not a very high threshold. I'm simply asking that these things be completed and the EMS agency verify that the new provider has been thoroughly trained and assessed. So if you have an established process in place, and I'm sure all of our agencies do, then this really should not be that much of a work effort to get completed. We have identified 4 additional items for EMTs that need to be assessed on an annual basis. These are things that EMTs are permitted to do as part of state statute, but they may be infrequent events, and they're something that may require some additional training on to maintain competency. So we have 4 additional skills assessment that we would like all EMTs to undertake. The first is the iGel. EMTs are permitted as part of scope of practice to place an iGel in the circumstance of a patient suffering a cardiopulmonary arrest. So if that's part of their scope of practice, I would like to know that they have the skills and training necessary to safely place an iGel on a patient who's in cardiopulmonary arrest. Same thing with an AED. EMTs are permitted to use AEDs. I just want verification that they have the knowledge and training necessary to use an AED safely. And then EpiPens and intranasal Narcan are other items that we like to have verification of EMT knowledge and training on. So I think everybody's probably wondering, well, what happens if a provider doesn't meet the clinical standard? Well, first off, we're giving you plenty of opportunity and advance notice that this change is coming. So I think everybody can work toward it. And we really haven't made the standard very rigorous in terms of what has to be done. But if a individual provider fails to meet the expectations of the standard, then I may withdraw or restrict authorization for the provider to practice under the MEC EMS protocol. I realize that this may have an effect on the relationship with their department, but again, I think we're giving you plenty of time and opportunity to meet the requirements of the standard. And the action plan for compliance will be determined on a case-by-case basis. What can you do? I would suggest you read the clinical standard. It will be distributed along with the link for this video. I also suggest you review the position paper, position statement that's come out through NAMSP and the National Registry. I think that'll give you background information which will make a lot of this make sense to you. Take every action that's necessary to meet the credentialing and recredentialing criteria. And keep in mind that this is a new venture for us. Please provide constructive feedback. This is a dynamic document. It will change with time. I anticipate in the future we may add some additional criteria, but that will be thoroughly discussed and thought through before we put it in place. So thank you for your time. Again, please review the materials. If you have any questions, please post them on Workplace.